Welcome back to the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley. Thanks for joining us again as we talk about topics such as life and faith and ministry. And we have a new one for you today.
Yeah, well, let's hope the dog manages to stay quiet throughout because we do have a bit of construction going on nearby. And she gets a little excited about that.
She's just doing her job and protecting our home from every sound and person moving anywhere outside.
In the neighborhood.
Yes. So we're very, very safe. Well, today, I don't know, do you remember back in, I think it was all the way back to the 80s. As you know, I love music. There was a band called Living Colour, and they were a cool band because it was all African-American dudes doing like rock music, so it was kind of unique.
I do remember, yes.
They had their very most famous song is called Cult of Personality. Mm-hmm. I still have it in my playlist today.
Oh, do you?
I do, yeah. It pops up every now and then. Well, we're going to talk about what is a cult of personality within the church and in sort of relationship to discipleship. Now, we know a lot of you are starting to fall asleep because I said discipleship, but that's okay because I think it's a really important topic.
We can use a different word.
But I know when we talk about discipleship, some of you guys turn off, but I think it's really, really important and is one of the key factors that's missing in the universal church, the general church today. And it's a reason why we're seeing Bible literacy go down. It's a reason why people are abandoning their faith. It's a reason people are deconstructing their faith is because, yes, they became Christians or they were part of a church, but they were never really discipled well. And I think there's some elements within the way the organization of the church in modern days that is leading towards people leaving and not being discipled.
Yeah, there was a tendency, a change of direction, I suppose, for churches in about the 80s and 90s where they started to focus more on things like leadership and how many, what were the numbers and how many people are being saved or baptized or coming through the door.
Church growth.
Church growth plans were the big thing.
Yes.
And the whole shift really sort of changed churches from this is how we operate to, let's take on a more of a corporate business model and start using corporate business language. Yeah,
well, I've been doing some reading lately, and a lot of the, I guess, best thinkers around discipleship in the church and all, and one of them was quoting, and he was saying, if your goal is to make disciples, you always get the church. So if you make disciples, you'll get a church. But if your goal is to build a church, you rarely get disciples. And so I think we've had multiple decades where our focus has been church growth and numbers and, building kind of empires sometimes, unfortunately. I mean, just to be honest, there are some people who built empires as opposed to building God's kingdom, and their local expression of that. But when we start doing that, we're not going to have disciples and we're not going to have mature people who can bring the kingdom and share the gospel and do it effectively.
One of the things that we can see in these types of situations is this cult of personality. So throughout the 80s and 90s is when it sort of kicked off and it got even worse after that. But it was to do with the fact that preachers were able to then be shown on television and on radio. They were heard on radio and seen on TV.
And the origins of the internet came.
And then the internet after that made it exponentially more so. But what you had is you started to see people who were charismatic and good speakers elevated and placed on these pedestals, and they would garner these followers. So instead of having a small church where you have people, leaders kind of discipling and speaking into and sowing into the lives of their congregants, instead you started to have these mega churches. That's what developed in the US. And
other places
and
too.
Other places, but specifically there.
Yeah, it was definitely the age of the megachurch. That's where it all sort of started.
And they sort of developed because of this accessibility through television and radio and then the internet. And it was all centered around a personality rather than simple biblical truths or the Bible. And what is evidence of that is when it sort of all comes crashing down if something happens to that person.
Yeah, to that leader. I mean, I know growing up, You had a lot of the tele-evangelists who got in trouble. We are all familiar with that. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in a mega church, and even here in Australia, I served in kind of the Australian version of a really large church. I mean, you'd probably define it as a mega church for Australia. And there's nothing, I want to preface to say that there's nothing wrong with the mega church. In fact, they do a lot of good, and they have a great influence and all of that. But if it is done in a way where the main person becomes that cult of personality, where we're going because Pastor Jones, he's the best speaker and I got to go hear him speak. Yeah. It leads into consumerism. It leads into a lot of different things where we're now following a man as opposed to being a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, I listened to that podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and in that they quoted Mark Driscoll a few times, and they talked about the cult of personality there, but he was even saying things like, I'm a big deal, and the church is me.
I'm the brand.
When you have a leader that's starting to say stuff like that, and when your whole church really is grown and built around someone's personality, that is a cult. I mean, it's a cult of personality. It's not, you're not following God, you're not following the Bible. And when he resigned, that whole church, there were, I can't remember, 12, 15 locations, something like that, all came crumbling down. It was over. It was done because it was built around him and his personality rather than on a foundation of God. So we go to a large church, and we had our senior pastor resign and move on to something else, and we simply search for a new senior pastor, and the church continues on with no problems whatsoever. It's just a smooth transition because it was not built around the senior pastor's personality.
Well, I'd even say in our time there, we're about to have our third pastor. So he wasn't the initial one. So it's transitioned a couple of times between people leading the church, but it's not based on them. Like, we come to church to worship God and to fellowship and to be in that community and to worship God and do that stuff, but we're not there for a person, for put on a show, we're not there just to hear a speaker or because the worship's the best in the world and, that kind of thing. I mean, again, I'm not criticizing like Hillsong, but a lot of people went there because the music was incredible, and that's not the reason.
So that's not one personality necessarily, but it's kind of, a cult of the music.
Well, I mean, the personality of the church was based on that worship team. Yeah. And so, it's not one person, but it's like an element of cult of personality.
Yeah. And so what you end up having is followers rather than disciples. And so it's sort of like having a really big Instagram following. In a way, it's not something of substance. You're not actually discipling and feeding into the lives of all of those people listening. So if you've got millions of followers, they aren't your disciples. You're not discipling them for Jesus. They're just following you.
Yeah. And look, there's an element to that in discipleship. I mean, Jesus basically said, do what I say, do what I did. And he commanded us even, in the Great Commission to go and teach and observe all the things I've taught you, right? So there is this mimicking element to discipleship of reproducing yourself. And that's a fact as a leader. You are reproducing yourself. It's just, what are you reproducing? And so like in his book, Scandal of Leadership by J.R. Woodward, I've been reading about that. He really points out that if leaders are not in a place where they have accountability and where they're growing in God and growing in Jesus, that they can't reproduce that in the people that they lead.
Yeah, and if they're not being open and vulnerable and honest about who they are and what their life involves, then you're not actually discipling them. So you're not discipling people. This is a definition of a cult of personality in religious settings. It refers to the excessive elevation of a leader's status and influence, often to the point where they are treated with an almost divine reverence. This can manifest as an overemphasis on the leader's personality, teachings, or actions, sometimes overshadowing the core tenets of the faith or the needs of the wider community. And what happens, what we see, is when there's a cult of personality, they might do something egregious, like they might abuse someone, or they might harm someone, or they might even say things that are extremely harmful or revealing of their heart. but their followers, their acolytes, they dismiss it and they attack anyone who says, this is an issue. This is an issue. We should be addressing this. They are these sort of avid followers who suppress any dissension or any argument or any hint that there might be an issue, and they don't address the details, and they don't find that restitution, and they don't call for that repentance from the leader. And we also see people who are those personalities that have cult-like followings. Sometimes they end badly and there's a fall from grace, but then there's no grace for them from their congregation because they were on this pedestal and the pedestal gets cut out from under them.
Yeah, well, I think whenever you get so big, if you are no longer accountable, if there's not someone, I don't know who said this, but I have read it or heard it, but basically, if there's not somebody in your life that can tell you no, you're in the wrong place. Like you've gotten too big. If there's not someone in your life that can say no and enforce that, then you need to make some changes really quick. And there are a lot of leaders who unfortunately have gotten to that position. And look, I think it's lovely that we respect and love church pastors, leaders, speakers, that kind of thing. I know from my own experience, like we give our lives for the church and for people. And so it's nice to have that respect. But the thing is, when we start to glorify those people beyond being just a normal human, that's when we start to get into trouble.
I think one of the big issues, though, as well, is when congregants or followers are glorifying or lionizing these leaders because of personality traits rather than because of their life for God. So they might be following them because they're really charismatic, or they say one of the things people like, they say this things no one else is willing to say, or, they speak hard truths, or they stand up to, the establishment or whatever it might be. But you're following them and you're lionizing them because of their personality or the way they say things, because of their charisma, because they're a good speaker, that sort of thing, rather than following them because they are Christ-like. And so when it's revealed that they're not Christ-like and that there's things going on that are causing issues, and not just, none of us are exactly like Christ, so I'm not condemning them for that, but when they are actively bringing harm to people and then others don't allow that to be spoken about or addressed, then that becomes a real issue. And it actually impacts the name of God and it impacts the name of the church. So, the Bible says don't take the Lord's name in vain. And I think that also refers to don't walk out and about in the world saying I'm a Christian while you're doing things that completely contradict the word of God and harm people.
Yeah, that are not a reflection of Jesus. That's the whole thing of discipleship, is becoming Christ-like.
Yeah.
That's what we're supposed to be. And as I've said in a past podcast, the Great Commission, this is Jesus's last words. This is what he's saying. This is what you need to remember. This is most important. Go and make disciples. That's the job of the church, is to make disciples. It's not to build an empire. It's not to build a mega church. Now, that may come, as I say, I have nothing against mega churches, but if our goal is to build our own kingdom, we're not going to be building God's kingdom. And that's where the problem comes in. And in, the last 30 years, you look around and most of the really big influencers within the Christian faith, whether that's pastors like Mark Driscoll or others, they just about, without fail, all have had very large moral failures. They've all come off that pedestal, as you say. And the impact is the world now does not trust the church. They go, well, if that's your most successful, best example of church, why would I bother?
Look at Ravi Zacharias, for example. In his lifetime, he was one of the most outspoken voices on behalf of Christianity in the world.
As an apologist, yeah.
Yeah.
Defending the faith, yeah.
And then after his death, it comes out that he was abusing all these people and living this double life, and just horrendous stuff came out about him. So that really is a negative impact, has a negative impact on the Christian church and faith, but also on God. It dishonors God's name.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like it just all the good that he did kind of gets neutralized in that, you know.
Yeah, because then you're questioning his motives. Was he doing good, or was he just building an empire for himself?
Yeah, was he just a really great debater, and this was the topic he chose to defend? You know, that sounds very judgmental, I think, to some degree. And we do need to have grace, and we need to have forgiveness, and
well, we
all
just
that.
don't know. That's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. The Hillsong, it's had failures. You know, you look at Willow Creek, which is another major, huge, influential church in the world. It's had failures. The Mars Hill had failures. You know, every one that I can start to list, you start to see these things happening. And I think this is why, as I was saying, I've been reading J.R. Woodward's book on the scandal of leadership, and he sort of proposes that instead of having that one charismatic leader at the top that influences a church or a movement, it's much better to have a polycentric leadership model.
Yeah.
Now, you might go, okay, what did you just say? It's a polycentric leadership. The first time I heard it too, I went, what? Basically what that means is it's almost sort of leadership in community. Like, so you have a partnership you have leaders as opposed to a leader. So you have multiple leaders, and at times, like the way he sort of described it, I was recently able to go to a workshop with him. The way he describes it is if you've ever seen a flock of geese that fly, and they do the V shape, right? We don't see it here in Australia too much, I don't think, but in America, you very often during their migration period, you'll see a flock of geese flying through the air in a V shape.
Yep.
Now, the one that's out front is actually doing a lot of work, but every single bird behind that lead bird gets to basically work off of him. And then at some point, that lead bird gets tired and it falls back and another bird comes to the front. That's what polycentric leadership is like, is that everybody's kind of part of it. You have different skills, you have different giftings, different abilities, but you all lead together, and at times you're out front and sometimes you're back at the back. And when you have that sort of leadership style going, it builds in accountability, support. It makes sure not one person's running the whole show, because you're not going to go off in the wrong direction, right? You've got people behind you who are supporting you and keeping you accountable and making sure that the leadership is solid and Jesus focused.
Here are some of the key characteristics of a cult of personality in churches. There's an exaggerated focus on the leader, their personality and charisma and pronouncements. There's unquestioning adoration, so members might be expected to unquestioningly accept the leader's pronouncements, even if they contradict doctrine or logic. Rituals of veneration, suppression of dissent, so you have people, you know, making sure that nobody's speaking up, or that if they are, no one hears them, or, you know, defending all the time. They often put up those walls around themselves, you know, have an office separate to everyone else, or, you know, that sort of thing.
It sounds like organizational communism with a dictatorship.
It does.
I mean, honestly, but it is. It's kind of a microcosm of that sort of environment.
Financial dependence, like large sums of money are directed towards the leader or their projects, but everything else is neglected. Manipulation and exploitation. So the leaders might manipulate the members for personal gain and that sort of thing. So this is what a cult of personality is. So how did Jesus do this differently? He wasn't a cult of personality. He was a discipler. He made disciples. So how did he do that differently? Well,
look, if you look at his life, he was always surrounded by people. Okay, so he wasn't just doing his own thing. He had the 3 that were very close, then he had the 12, and then you have the masses. But the other thing is he was always accountable to God. And he submitted himself to God. And this is a thing I think that leaders struggle with, because to show vulnerability or to show weakness or to show any of those things, we often try not to do that because it kind of undermines your leadership or your strength, right? But Jesus submitted himself to the Father to the point that he says, I'm only saying and doing what the Father says and does. I'm not making the calls. He was submitted completely to God, and he did what God was instructing him to do. And so he had that accountability there, plus he had the accountability of the other people around him. He was always in community. I think it's isolation, and I think it's things like not being in a position where someone can say no to you, that's where you start to get into trouble.
And we notice as well that Jesus had the 12, and he had some other disciples as well that sort of followed around a group of people. But he didn't have thousands and millions of followers, and he invested into the lives of the people who followed him. And in fact, the faith grew larger after his death when the disciples went out and discipled and grew churches, and those disciples then discipled people and so on.
Well, I think that's why I started with, I think we've gotten off track because our focus has been on numbers. You know, our focus has been on church growth. How do I make my church bigger? Jesus didn't care how big the church was.
No.
He cared about how big God was inside of a person.
Yeah.
You know, that was it was quality over quantity. And many times Jesus ran from the crowds. Like, you know, there's so many stories where, yes, he drew crowds, but that was not his purpose. He
didn't then say what the crowd wanted to hear. He often said things that confounded, confused, and upset them.
Well, that's it. And oftentimes, as I say, he tried to run from the crowds. I mean, he very easily and very quickly could have, I don't know, found a mountainside and built a theater there, and he would have had a whole new thing just going, you know, and he could have built this church right here that would have rivaled anything of the day. But he didn't do that. He very intentionally didn't put down roots in that way because it wasn't about building an empire. It was about building God's kingdom, and it's just a very different thing. And even the disciples, they didn't understand that. And even today, the Messiah, you know, a lot of Jews are still looking for the Messiah. They're looking for somebody who's coming to build this kingdom that kind of benefits them. You know, it's for their benefit. And that's not what Jesus was about. And his disciples didn't even understand that. Like, even though they spent that time with him, they kept going, well, when are you going to take over? Like, well, when are you going to, you know? And it was like, no, that's not what I'm about.
I think as people who are attending churches or listening to podcasts or YouTube or whatever, and we've got all these resources that we can sort of reach from wherever we are at this point, it's very easy to be part of those kind of cult of personalities because you see someone and they're charismatic and they're a good speaker and they say things that are really interesting and so on. But I believe what we should really be doing and play our part in this is to seek after God and to ask for discernment and really to look at, okay, what is this person's life like? How can I honor God in what I listen to and who I follow? And for me personally, I don't sort of suffer from the desire to put people on pedestals. It's just not part of my personality. And so when someone like Ravi Zacharias, who I've seen and I've listened to and thought, oh yeah, wow, that's really great. When he falls from grace, I'm sad because I'm upset for the people he hurt, but it doesn't shake my faith because I didn't have him on a pedestal. I wasn't following him. And I think as Christians, that's what we need to make sure we're following Jesus, because people will let us down. But also we need to use discernment in who we do invest our time and energy into supporting. We need to be careful not to just follow svelte figures and good words and all this sort of stuff. And if we're spending time in God's presence, we're spending time in his word, in prayer, and surrounding ourselves with genuine believers who feed into our lives and being discipled and discipling others, we aren't as likely to be taken in by these big charismatic kind of personalities, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true. But like I look at, for instance, Billy Graham, and Billy had this worldwide ministry, very large, you know, reached lots of people. We've talked about it before where, you know, here in Australia, he had such an impact and so many people from Australia became Christians, and the ones that didn't at least heard the gospel and all that. But if you look at his life, he was always submitted to somebody else, and he put in all these precautions and stuff because, yes, a lot of the moral failures that we see with these prominent people often are in affairs and other things. Like, he had a rule. He would never be in a room with a woman without another person there. And you might go, well, that's kind of extreme. But he put things in and had accountability, and he was always in community with people. And I think that's the key, is
Yeah.
we need to be in community.
With God and with people. We need to be relying on God. And that's what Jesus did. So when he was surrounded by crowds, often he would withdraw, but he would go spend time with God. And one of the things that happens with these charismatic leaders is the bigger they get, the less time they have to spend with God, because they're focusing on, and they might start out with the really good intentions. They want to win hearts for Jesus, but the more they do that and the bigger the numbers are and the bigger they become, the less time they spend with God, seeking God, being renewed by, being transformed into Christ-likeness, all of that sort of stuff. And so what you see is people who are gifted and charismatic and big personalities, but maybe don't have the character to carry what comes with the success of a digital and modern age sort of following. They wouldn't have been able to reach millions in the past, but now you can reach millions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing. Gifting kind of only carries you as far as your character goes. Like, God never revokes a calling and a gifting on your life, but your character has to be built to go to the same heights that your gifting and calling are. And if we're not in those places, I think it becomes really detrimental to the person and to the people following. And look, even today, like, you're listening to a Christian podcast today, all right? And there's value in the stuff that you can hear from different people, and you can watch on YouTube, and you can read books and all that stuff. All those things are valuable, but most of you guys that listen are not in relationship with Bronwyn and I, right? We don't know each other. You don't know our lives intimately the same way that we do with our home group. And I think it's really important that we have community and we have other people that speak into our life, that we speak into their life. And that's where we grow as Christians. Everything else, even this podcast, it's information. We're giving you information. Now, you might agree with it. You might disagree with it. It might be helpful information. It might not be, but it's just information. But it's not going to transform your life outside of relationship. So you need to be in places. And so I guess what I'm saying is, even if you go to a mega church or you follow this person who has a cult of personality, okay, as we've termed it, if you don't have relationship there and you're just going because they entertain you or they give you something, you've become just a consumer. It's like going to a concert because you like an artist's music. Okay, you don't know the artist. You're not going to have a relationship with them. You don't know why they wrote that song or what they were struggling with or what was going on, but it's connected with you in some way, and you are just consuming it because you relate. All right, well, that's a problem. We actually need to be in relationship with one another and with the people who are investing into our lives. So, Like I say, all the books, sermons, podcasts, whatever you listen to, watch, read, it's all information, and it can be very valuable. We can learn and grow that way. But outside of those personal relationships and in community, that's where we get into trouble, because that information unapplied just becomes information instead of transformational.
It's so important for us. So imagine you as a tree. So your roots go down into the ground. They're looking for water. And the Bible tells us that Jesus is the living water that we need. It's so important for us to have our roots firmly planted down into the ground where God and his word is, because otherwise when a wind comes along, we can just be toppled over. And I was speaking to someone recently, and she had read a book in her teenage years that outlined this idea that if you follow all of these different requirements and you're pure and you do the right thing and you live this holy life, then God is going to bring along this perfect husband for you. And it's this promise this book makes, right? She read that as a teenager. Probably, she was a wounded teenager and she didn't have a big firm foundation in God and that sort of thing. She clung on to the promises from that book, and it's really wounded her throughout her life because it didn't work out the way that the book promised that it would. And so putting your faith in a person or a book or a show or whatever it might be, and learning from that and letting that sort of be the foundation of your faith is always going to let you down. We have to have our roots firmly planted in God and his word and in a daily relationship with him, so that if someone we know who is a preacher or an author or whatever, they've somehow influenced our life. If something happens and there's a fall from grace or they harm us in some way, it doesn't just knock us over.
Yeah, well, our faith has to be in God and God alone. And yes, if we put our faith in a promise of a book, it's likely that you're going to be disappointed. It's likely that you're going to get let down. It's the same thing if you put your faith in a human being, no matter how amazing and dynamic they are. I mean, we see a little bit of this in the U.S. with Trump. There's all these Trumpers who just, their whole world revolves around Trump and MAGA and what he's going to do and all that kind of stuff. Well, he could die tomorrow. Stuff could happen. Stuff could come out. And what are you left with? If your whole hope and your whole faith is in a person, it doesn't matter who they are, that's a unsteady ground. The Bible talks about building your house on sand or versus the rock.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
You're building your house on sand if it's a human person.
Yeah.
Now, there are plenty of people that we should listen to and that are influencing us with the truth and with good stuff from God. I mean, we can grow, but
if you haven't founded yourself in God,
yes,
in a relationship with Him and His Word, when they say things that aren't actually biblical or godly, but they might sound like it, but you don't know that they're not because you haven't founded and grounded yourself in the Word and in God, then you're going to easily be led astray.
And you're up for disappointment, and probably really damaging disappointment. So our faith has to be in God and not a person. Thank you for joining us on the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley once again. We're so glad to have all of our listeners with us, and we just hope that you've been blessed with today. Hopefully it's challenged you in some of your thinking. If you know someone that needs to hear this, please pass it on to them, and we really appreciate your time and listening every week. We just pray that you'd have a blessed day.